we might have hoped to cover more material than is possible because we are a little behind. So we're going to cut a few corners here. We want to talk a little bit about prioritizing across DERs, but I'm going to jump a few slides just so we get to the key points for this section, because we've touched on them somewhat in the context of the secondary test discussion. We want to make sure we leave time for the last session around addressing rate impacts. So Tim, why don't you start off by reviewing this slide here, and then I'm going to skip to slide 35.
Okay, so first of all, this issue about prioritizing across DERs is relatively new. And in fact, there aren't a whole lot of states that I'm aware of where they even have dockets to do this. You know, most of the time you get DERs are analyzed in silos. And that's a problem because everyone I talk to would really like to understand how the DERs compare with each other, because that's really how you optimize. So we offer some ideas here for how to do that. And you know, you may need to do this in existing dockets, even if they're siloed, or you may need new dockets. But either way, it's a pretty important part of the analysis. I think most people would agree. And so the first thing is, if you're going to compare one DER type to another, you have to have this similar test or the same test ideally. We talked a little bit about how to do that above. So we're not going to go into that again, but even if you do have a single primary test, there's still other questions about how you prioritize and how you deal with different goals and rate impacts and so forth. So we're going to go through a couple of ways to do that. And again, these are ideas. There's no magic formula and there's no single way to do it, but I hope these ideas are helpful for you. You can go on, Julie.
Do you want me, I think we can go right to slide 35, no?
I'd rather take the time. I'd rather delete the last 10 minutes of discussion since we've had it all along.
Yeah, okay, well, we got to move then. Sure, go ahead.
So I just want to give you a little background, and I think this is helpful. Imagine you've got whatever we have here, like 12 different DERs, and now I'm actually specifying which kind they are. And you have a primary test that includes utility system, greenhouse gas impacts, and other fuels. And these are your results, your benefit cost ratios. Now here you have every one of these passes your primary test. They all pass. And you know, you could expand this. In fact, I originally did. You could have 20, you could have 30 or 40 of these. But anyways, to keep it simple, you've got these. And the question is, next slide, please. You know, what do you do with this? How do you decide which ones to do? You know, should the utility implement every one? You know, if not, you know, which ones do you keep? How do you ensure you're meeting your policy goals? How do you ensure you're not paying too much? How do you ensure rate impacts are reasonable? Next slide. So again, we have a few ideas for how to do this. One of the key things once you get to this point is you almost have to establish planning objectives. Now, I noticed in the chat we've had today, a lot of people said, well, it depends upon your priorities and it depends upon other considerations. And that's what this is about. It's about coming up with, okay, we need to find a way to cut through this and prioritize. And so that means coming up with planning objectives. And we have some examples here that we describe in the NSPM. You know, one might be implement the most cost-effective DERs. One might be get the most net benefits, reduce customer bills, avoid rate impacts, and achieve greenhouse gas goals, achieve a diverse range of DERs for multiple reasons. These are all reasonable planning objectives. What we've done here is we picked 4 and just show you a couple of techniques for how you can then look at the results of your BCAs and then maybe make some decisions. Next slide. So the first one's fairly simple. You can take your benefit cost ratios by your DERs and sort them from, you know, the most cost effective to the least. And that's what we've done here. And then you can decide, okay, the top 7 are, you know, sound and really solid, and the bottom 3 are not, whatever. That's just one way to do it. But that's not the only way. Next slide. A little more complicated here. Here you want to get the biggest bill reductions. and let's just say you're an electric utility and you want to get the biggest electric utility bill reduction. So here, again, you sort by the utility cost test because that's the test that tells you about bill reductions, and it doesn't include any policy goals. And we've done that. We've reorganized these, resorted them so that you have the ones with the greatest net benefits at the top and the ones with the lowest net benefits at the bottom. And at the bottom, you've got a handful where the benefits to the utility system and therefore the reductions in bills are the lowest, even though they happen to have some pretty significant policy benefits. And so here, the same kind of concept is you can then, now that you've got this, you can say, well, I think I'm going to accept the top 6 and delete the bottom 4 because the net benefits aren't big enough for those ones at the bottom. Again, it's just another dimension to look at. Next slide. Here, it's a little bit of a different approach, but if your goal is to achieve your greenhouse gas targets at the lowest cost, well, then you can put your results of your BCA in those terms. Here, what we've done is first you estimate levelized cost. This is just cost we're talking about now. And by levelizing them, it means you come up with a single number that represents the same a single number that's the same every year that represents the same value as if it changed every year. So you get one single number for the costs of each DER type. And then you put that in terms of dollars per ton of greenhouse gas avoided. And that shows you then how each of these DERs will achieve that one particular goal. And, you know, it's not obvious right away, but if you look, you'll see this is a different sorting than we saw in the previous 2 slides. You get a different result if this is your primary goal. The other advantage of doing this is that you can, at the bottom, the x-axis here, in addition to telling the cost, the width of each bar tells you how many greenhouse gas emissions you can achieve with each DER. And that way you can kind of see how close this stack of resources gets you to your target. And if your target for greenhouse gas emission reductions happens to be, you know, well, there's no numbers here, but right up at the orange block, right, of building electrification number 2, then you would do all your DERs up to that point, and then you might stop. So again, it's just another way to take the data, work with it, and use it to show different ways of achieving your different planning objectives. So I think we're going to skip this poll in the interest of time. But what you can do is, you know, in any one state, if this is your question, then you can identify your planning objectives and then go from there. And again, there's no single answer. There's just a way to take the data that we have in the framework we've developed and use it to answer your questions.
Joe raises a great point. He says it's not simple to segregate DRs as they may need to work in combination, interactive effects or the whole thing. Right. Also, we are trying to incent the adoption of DRs by customers as the utility may not have control over behind the meter purchases by customer.
Yep.
Yes.
All good points. There's 2 key points. One is, yeah, there are interactive effects, and we talk about that in the NSPM. And ideally, those should be accounted for in your benefit cost analysis, and therefore be reflected in all those examples I just showed you. It's not easy. I will say that if you're talking about a building or a non-wire solution, it's especially important to get those interactive effects. If you're talking about the entire system, a little bit less so, but nonetheless, it's a fair point. Everything you're seeing here is a simplification. You should know that. This is not an easy job, but at least, you know, with the tools and the right, you know, analysis, you can get the answers you want. And secondly, yeah, there's this whole issue of customers adopting DERs on their own. In fact, in a way, that's the best outcome if the utilities don't have to provide incentives. In those contexts, we don't necessarily need to do a benefit cost analysis, right? The whole purpose of this manual is to apply these concepts to help utilities and regulators and other stakeholders decide how utilities should act, where they should put their money. If customers decide for other reasons to do this, then fine, but that's sort of a different question that is to be answered.